Good morning and welcome to the 6th meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee, and I remind all members and witnesses to ensure their devices are on silent. We've received apologies from Mark Griffin, MSP. And the first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Are members agreed? We're agreed, thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence as part of our inquiry on the council tax system in Scotland. And I welcome our witnesses to the meeting. We have around 90 minutes for this discussion and have a lot to cover, so I'd be grateful if we could keep questions and answers succinct. And we're joined for this item in the room by Paul Ferguson, who's the Senior Service Manager for Housing at Falkirk Council and a member of the Scottish Executive of Institute Revenues Rating and Valuation, otherwise known as IRRV. Heather Honeyman, who is Assessor for Fife Council and President of the Scottish Assessors Association, and Brian Rout, who is the Assessor for Scottish Borders Council and Secretary of the Scottish Assessors Association. And we're joined online by Matthew Evans, who is the Head of Service at Revenue and Benefits Wrexham Council and President of the Institute of Revenues Rating and Valuation Wales Association, and Lisa Hayward, who is the Finance Policy Officer, Revenues and Benefits at the Welsh Local Government Association. And we're now going to turn to questions from members. We'll try to direct our questions to a specific witness in the first instance, but if you would like to come in, please indicate to myself or the clerks, and Matthew and Lisa, please do that by typing an R in the chat function. Also, there's no need for you to operate your microphones. We'll do that for you. And I'm going to start. And the first kind of area of questions that we have is around reevaluation experiences in Wales and the lack of one in Scotland. And Paul, I'm going to queue you up for this question initially, but I'm also later on going to bring in folks with some other questions, the folks from Wales. So the 2015 Commission on Land Tax Reform, on Local Tax Reform, was a major piece of work involving consultation, research, and cross-party engagement. And I'd be interested to understand from your perspective why this ultimately failed to lead to any significant changes.
I think the answer is purely political. The report was very thorough. It was well researched and well evidenced. At that time, it was just before the local income tax was being devolved to Scotland in 2016. So I can't say why it didn't happen, but I think at that point there was a lack of the political consensus to allow that to happen. There was no issues from the research that prevented it, and just down to that political aspect.
Okay, thanks for that. And I'll take the fact that no one else is jumping in, that there's an agreement there. And so further to that question, how can the recently announced engagement process in Scotland lead to anything different? How are we going to get there? What do you think?
I think for me, it would appear, from what I'm seeing and hearing, that we've ruled out a lot of the alternatives now, and we're focused more on the principle of reforming council tax and the revaluation. And I think that in the absence of any other alternatives, if that's what we're left with, then that can surely get that consensus that we sought before. I think in terms of the engagement with the public, that's absolutely crucial, but I think it's what is it we're offering the public here. So what is council tax? What is it for? What is the purpose of this review? Of it and the revaluation. So I think as long as the messaging is clear, I see no issue why it can't be part of all political parties at manifesto for 2026.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Anyone else got any thoughts of how we can actually achieve something through this latest engagement process? Anything new to add, or you don't have to?
I think the view of the SAA would be it would be a matter for the politicians, and we would implement whatever system was in place.
Okay, thanks very much. And turning to our Welsh colleagues, I'd be interested to understand why has reevaluation and reform of council tax been such a priority for the Welsh Government when it hasn't been in Scotland or England? And maybe go to Lisa on that. Yes, I actually had it written here.
Good morning. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's been a priority for the previous Senedd term, along with this current Senedd term, that council tax seems by its very nature just to be unfair. I think the the stream message was, you know, making council tax fairer. It seems highly regressive at the bottom of the scale, and it's not deemed as being a progressive tax at all. So it's been a commitment since 2016, since the previous Senedd term, to look at the whole range of situation that surrounds council tax, that's revaluation, but also looking wider, looking at discounts, disregards and exemptions. You can't take one element of something like local taxation in isolation. It has an impact right across. So it's been a real key focus of this current Senedd government and the previous term. That the whole emphasis has been looking at the whole process and making it fairer across Wales. Now, appreciated that was started in 2016 and we're now in 2025, so it's not a quick process, but there's been a lot of engagement, research, fact finding, public consultation, public engagement. It's taken an awful long time to get even where we are at this moment. And you might be aware that we were due to have a revaluation effective from this April 2025, but that has actually now gone and been deferred to April 2028.
Okay, thanks very much for that. But I hear that it's been a long-term commitment to carry this out, and that it's the fact that it's the unfair nature of it is what has been driving it. But I'm also hearing that it's taken a long time in terms of engagement and kind of bringing people along in the process.
Yes, absolutely. As with council tax, it seems to be more aggressive at the bottom bands compared to the ratios of what people pay as they get it to the higher bands. We did slightly improve that in Wales when we did the revaluation effective in 2005 and added a band at the top for higher charge properties. So it looks slightly fairer on the face of it. But yes, it's actually trying to get that message across that, you know, on a tax basis, even 22 years out of date now, it's not fair. And trying to make sure that everybody understands. But there's been an awful lot of work undertaken by the Welsh Government. They've had public user groups, focus groups to understand what is the kind of the public knowledge around council tax. And as you can imagine, it doesn't give you what you necessarily would expect to hear. There seems to still be people sort of understand council tax to a degree of it's the tax on their property, but actually how it's calculated, what it contributes to, not understanding how it fits into overall taxation and indeed local government finance.
Good, thanks. That's certainly the situation here. Paul, again, I'm going to direct this next question to you, but Heather and Brian, you might have something to come in on it as well. So writing as far back as 2003, the Welsh Government stated that the use of the 1991 property values seemed incongruous in light of changes within the housing market in Wales since 1991, and we can hear that kind of through what Lisa has been saying. What are the most obvious changes in the Scottish housing market that you're aware of since 1991?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer this question, but what I would say is the research suggests that our movement has been very similar to Wales at a global level, but it's the same issues was raised last week at this forum, that there are pockets where that growth has been much more exponential than other areas, and under revaluation, those areas, which is predominantly east of Scotland, would see the largest increases. So I think that there's no doubt that 1991 values are not a good basis for a tax in 2025. But I think that we need to recognise that to get us to the place we want to be, we need to do two things, which is obviously do that revaluation, create the appropriate bands that remove regression, and also ensure that revaluation is enshrined in law so that it's repeated on an appropriate cycle as well to prevent this issue from arising again.
Yeah, great. Heather or Brian, anything to add?
The only thing I would say is everything valued at 1991 is a common footing. Everybody is, the relationship between properties and values in different areas at that date, everybody's exactly the same. If there were to be a revaluation, obviously that would redistribute values around different areas, etc. But again, it would be to a common footing. I think it would probably be more relatable values as well, because obviously after 32 years, some people weren't even born and they're now paying council tax. So it would allow people perhaps to relate to valuations better.
Great. Thanks. Brian?
Yeah, certainly. My experience is that in 1991, there was seeming to be more demand for modern properties as there was for traditional stone-built properties with physical characteristics that people wanted traditional properties they want them now, or they wanted them now. There's been a change in the market, and these older traditional style properties with period features are invariably in lower bands. Now, the market's changed. We need to see how the market's changed. That's why a revaluation is key, as Heather says, to rebalance the whole banding system to get properties back in a relative position.
Yeah.
I think that's really key.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to bring in Willie Coffey with a number of questions.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to everybody. My questions are firstly for our Welsh colleagues, but I would really value a response to these from our Scottish colleagues as well, just to look forward and see what the potential impact for Scotland might be. But firstly, for our Welsh colleagues, the information we have about the revaluation impact in Wales seemed to suggest that authorities like Monmouthshire could see 40% of households moving up a band in your system, and in Wrexham, I think where Matt is from, it could be 11%. I wonder if you could just offer an explanation to the committee, our Welsh colleagues, why such changes occurred with the system that you have adopted. And either Matt or Lisa come in, I'd be welcome both of you.
Okay, I'm happy to start then, and Matthew can come in and give actually the direct Wrexham perspective there as well. Yes, well, going back to 2005 and then looking at the draft figures that we had pending a 2025 revaluation, significant movement in some areas. And I think the Welsh Government were quite clear you couldn't actually take new property values and drop them into the existing bandings. You had to look at the property base as a whole and do a complete reset, looking at the bands, looking at the ratios. Otherwise, naturally, there's been such a huge property change. You know, even since 2005, our previous revaluation, even the last 10 years have had such significant change, especially post-pandemic. So you couldn't just revalue and expect it to drop back in those existing boxes. They would have to be completely rewritten. You would have to look at the bands, look at the ratios. We considered adding bands on either end to actually properly reflect that property market. I mean, when you think that in 2005, we added a band for properties valued at 424,000 and up. That's 20 odd years ago, that was an extremely expensive property. Unfortunately, now that is, I dare say not, but you understand where I'm coming from. It's quite an acceptable price in so many areas. So a revaluation on its own, you have to then look at the whole bands and ratios, because otherwise everybody will just be moving up. And I know you comment about areas like Monmouth, typically perceived as being perhaps the more affluent authorities in Wales. But what we were seeing when we started looking at data from the Valuation Office was areas which had predominantly high levels of Band A and B properties. We're also seeing those values significantly move as well. So they could still potentially be in a revised Band A, but there was a huge shift right across the property market in Wales. And I'm sure that's obviously reflected in Scotland as well. But I'm sure Matthew can give a more eloquent answer on how it affected Wrexham.
Okay. Yeah, well, certainly in the original revaluation in 2005, I think Wrexham, Conway, Flintshire and Cardiff seen significant increases on that revaluation. And when work had been done 20 years later, I think Wrexham, Cardiff, Flintshire and Conway were some of the areas which have had a smaller increase since that, in effect, last revaluation, because of the sort of growth in property areas outside of that area. Now, some of the smaller areas in 2005 where the revaluation had little impact has seen some of the greater growth. I think in Wales, both Monmouth and the Vale of Glamorgan were seen as outliers in terms of where they would see significant increases in potential values because of the property market in those areas. It's seen as more affluent. I think the Vale of Glamorgan is seen as more, because of its location as such compared to Cardiff, is seen as affluent in that sense. I think looking over the past 20 years, in 2005, the average value of a property in Wales was 82,000. It's 215,000 20 years later. So it's a huge increase, and a lot of the values in those areas, using Monmouth as an outlier example and the Vale, their values, the properties there, there's a significant greater demand for properties in those areas, which is why the values have increased significantly beyond other areas in Wales.
Thank you both for that. Just to ask our Scottish colleagues, would you anticipate a similar pattern occurring in Scotland if there's a revaluation here? Will we see examples like that where 40% of households in a particular authority could jump up a band? Do you anticipate that that could happen here?
To be honest, at this point, we can't really answer that. We need to go away and look at some data and come back with a proper, accurate answer on that. But clearly, after the passing of 32 years, we're looking at a very different property market now. And obviously, as has been highlighted by Welsh colleagues, the bandings that we've got now, the lowest band's up to 27,000. You maybe got quite a lot up to 27,000 in 1991, but now, what sells for 27,000, then the top band offers over 212. Again, just going back to what was said earlier, it's putting it in context so that we don't know till we look at the data. We've not had a need to look at it at the moment. But clearly, yes, there's different areas where you will have seen significant increases and potentially areas that are maybe a wee bit flatter. But there is likely to be significant shift. Okay.
Any other comment, Brian, on that?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to draw a comparison with Wales, given that the revaluation was in 2005. Obviously, we haven't had a revaluation yet. We're now at 34 years for the valuation date, 32 years since council tax came in. So it's very difficult to try and draw a comparison with something that happened in 2005. As been mentioned, there's obviously been the pandemic since then as well. And as Heather clearly stated, until we look at the data, we won't know what the impact is. But there's certainly, you would expect there to be some changes in valuation relative to other areas in Scotland. For example, that was referenced last week, the east of Scotland compared to the west. But we don't know the data, but the hunch would be that would be the case.
Okay. Heather, back to you. Thanks.
Yes, if I could just add to what Brian was saying there, it also depends when we value. Obviously there would need to be a lead in time to a revaluation, and depending on what date that revaluation was carried out and came into force, that would clearly impact the values as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Back to my Welsh colleagues. How has Wales solved the problem of people being perhaps asset rich in terms of the value of their property and their ability to pay based on their income? How did Wales solve that particular issue? Because it's certainly been mentioned in Scotland for many years, and it's emerged again at the committee in recent weeks. So how did Wales deal with that particular issue?
Well, in 2005, excuse me, we had what was then the Council Tax Benefit Scheme, which was funded through central government. So people were able to apply for a reduction in their bill based on their income. A means test was carried out and the bill was reduced accordingly. Of course, post-2012, council tax benefit abolished, and then we've got our Welsh scheme, Council Tax Reduction Scheme, which I believe operates similar to the scheme in Scotland. Excuse me. So we've got a fully funded support scheme. So unlike what we know happens in some English authorities, where some people have to make at least a contribution towards their council tax bill, with our support scheme, if your income is below a threshold, you can receive a full support, reducing your bill to zero or on a reducing scale. So we have that scheme where everyone who is liable to pay council tax can apply to council tax reduction scheme and accordingly. But of course, that is still only going to address a small percentage, and it's an argument that is frequently passed back to us about what is perceived as being asset rich and cash poor. You might be aware that we did, as part of our looking at council tax, was looking at the single person discount, the automatic 25% if an adult lives alone, and that was very much, there was a lot of media around that was predominantly claimed by older people, possibly widows or widowers living, remaining in the family household. But there are no plans to remove that 25% discount, because that was being perceived as, you would just be moving a bigger tax burden onto those people. But yes, it's something that we, through the engagement, have been trying to say, we have a support mechanism there. But of course, with any support scheme like that, which is means tested, there is still a cliff edge between those who will qualify for support and unfortunately those who don't. But again, it's also difficult to accurately say how many could be affected when you haven't got up-to-date property values to address it on.
Okay. Is there any particular discretion afforded to pensioner households, Lisa, in Wales, who clearly draw their only income from their pension, or is it all contained within the rebate scheme? Yeah, it's all contained. Unlike in England, we treat all working age and pension age households equitably. So its income is assessed, and if you're entitled to full support, you will receive full support. But I think Matthew's just indicated he's going to come in on this one as well. Matthew?
Yeah, I think, as Lisa's already alluded, there is the council tax reduction scheme, which has helped in some cases with a sort of more refreshed value. There is a lot of evidence or suggestions made that council tax is regressive. In reality, operationally, there are a few isolated examples, and we look at, in effect, helping individuals through Section 13A where we can, but they're probably very isolated incidents. There's a lot of suggestions that it's an issue, but we've yet to see it really on an operational basis on a day-to-day occurrence. The support scheme is there. That tends to address the majority of cases, which, I can't really elaborate much more than that. The support scheme is there. Discounts, I think, when consultations were done previously, mixed views on single person discount. I think it's a fundamental part of the tax base, which is one of the issues which changed from community charge to council tax. And a discount scheme needs to be there. That's not means tested. You could look at means testing that in the future, but that adds complexity and cost. So I would rather personally move away from that type area.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. And again, from our Scottish colleagues, if Scotland does a revaluation and adopts a system based on the property value and they are much higher, would that put additional pressure on our rebate scheme? Would be effective, would be giving bigger, more rebates if this process were to go along the lines of our Welsh colleagues? Yeah, if I could maybe go back to 2005 first of all and compare ourselves to Wales. Obviously, Wales is just that ninth band, the band I, but in 2017 we changed our ratios, so actually our band H pays more than our Welsh band I. We pay 2.45 times a band D, they pay 2.33 times a band D. So all our band E, F, G and H properties pay more than the Welsh equivalents already. So with regards to the council tax reduction scheme, it does offer protection to those in the very lowest income, but it is really quite restricting that nature. I think the Burt review back in 2005-2006 has suggested a couple of changes, one of which was actually allowing a higher capital threshold before they were excluded from the scheme. That's not to say capital wouldn't be taken into account as a notional value for income, but more the fact that it wasn't excluding them from that scheme, and they suggested £50,000 at that time. And we are still sitting at £16,000 as that absolute threshold. So I think there's that part to consider. What I do think is that the council tax reduction scheme in Scotland could be expanded and made more generous. I think the numbers that we have in receipt of that scheme, I think, have reduced from about £550,000 back in 2015 when the local Commission for Local Taxation was discussing it, down to £450,000. And I think maybe by even halving the taper, you can maybe go back up to that sort of similar level of support and making sure that more people were included, and more importantly for me, are protected from future increases in charge. Once they're on that scheme, that means their payment is absolute and they won't pay any increases applied by local authorities going forward. Okay, thanks very much for that, Paul. My final question really, again, for our Welsh colleagues was about the impact on local government revenue grants as a result of different income coming to that authority as a result of the revaluation. So were there winners and losers in terms of the Welsh local authorities in terms of the income they took from the new council tax system, and were adjustments made to the revenue settlement to the local councils in Wales to try and reflect that and rebalance it?
Lisa? Or Matthew, yeah, come on.
Yeah, when we did the original revaluation in 2005, it was said at that time it'd be revenue neutral. So when we had revised council tax bases, the revenue support grant was reallocated. So in effect, if your tax base had increased substantially, your RSG would be adjusted. And when we looked at revaluation more recently, again, that same principle would be applied. I think that went out to consultation. There were mixed views on that, dare I say, amongst the local authority community in terms of what is better, increased revenue support grant or the certainty of council tax income. And I think when we did our consultation in 2023, that was a period where there was incredibly high inflation. So it was trying to balance those two pressures. And I don't think that message was understood or explained particularly as clearly as it needed to be to get people to understand it. And there'd probably be more work needed to bring people on board on that area, certainly from the local authority community.
Thank you, Matt. Lisa, can you add anything to that?
Absolutely echo what Matthew said. I know with the recent consultation, we had a lot of information published, similar to yourselves, through the Institute for Fiscal Studies, looking at the potential and how revenue support grant could be distributed. And myself and my colleague in the WLGA did a lot of work at local authority level, speaking to some individual authorities who had concerns, saying what potentially the impact could be. And there was, as Matthew noted, a concern between could some authorities who could potentially be benefiting quite significantly from a revaluation, but then would that make them over-reliant on revenue support grant, something which they wouldn't necessarily know moving into the future. And it did become quite apparent that when we go to the next stage, and we know we're going to revalue in 2028, we need to do a lot more exploratory work on the impact to RSG and how that affects the individual councils, because naturally there was a huge concern. So you've got, exactly as Matthew mentioned, reliance on revenue support grant or reliance on your own local income that you generate to a degree. So having learned from all the information that we had at this last consultation and the engagements with local authorities, with all their elected members and leaders, when we come to having the new data from Welsh Government and the Valuation Office Agency to start preparation for 2028, we need to do a lot more work on what that actually means in fiscal terms for each local authority, because there was concern. But a bit like what Heather answered to the previous question, sometimes it's we don't know until we start really getting some of that data back. But we have learned from experience we do need to really dig into those individual impacts at local authority level.
Thanks, Lisa. And just finally to the Scottish Colleges, would you anticipate a similar set of circumstances occurring here where Scottish authorities might lose out and some might gain significantly, and for there to be a rebalancing effect in terms of the revenue support for the councils to take that into account? Would you anticipate us embarking in that journey as well, Paul?
No, I think that's absolutely essential. I mean, council tax budgets are reliant on council tax to balance the books. That's set down in law that's what we have to do. If the council's cost of delivering the services doesn't change and the council tax income reduces based on a negative revaluation for that local authority area, then it's essential that the revenue support grant fills that gap. And the only way that can do that is by other authorities who would gain from the revaluation reducing their level of revenue support grant. So it's the net effect has to be nil for local authorities, but that no local authority can suddenly cut its costs overnight. So it's absolutely essential, yes.
Okay. No other comments. Thanks very much for your contributions here. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Willie. And we're now going to move to a question from Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Convener. Could the Scottish Assessors Association describe how valuation is done at the moment? For example, if a new house is built, what is the process followed to place the value of that property in 1991 prices?
If a new house comes on stream now, obviously we would go out, survey that house, gather all the factual details on it. Houses are valued by the comparative method of valuation, so by comparing them to similar properties within the vicinity in the local area. So we use all the property data to compare the houses. We do have to relate it back to 1991 levels, which can in some cases be challenging, but we do have sales around that date, which gives us a basis to the valuation. And if that is challenged, we need to go to the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service and defend that valuation. If the house was built in 2020, we're still relating it back to 1991 levels, and we do have to defend that course of action in a court of law.
Last week's witnesses said that this situation discredits the whole council tax system. Would you agree with that?
I think it can make it very challenging. I think it makes it very difficult for people to relate to 1991, especially if, say, they weren't around in 1991, and even for those of us that were, it's quite difficult to look back and remember what things were like at that time. Obviously, there's a lot of new types of housing coming on stream now as well, which, you know, that base that we use might be slightly different from, so you have to take that into consideration as well when valuing. I do think a revaluation as well in terms of perceived inequity around, there's something called rebanding on sale, which means that there are only 3 occasions when you can change a banding on the council tax valuation list, and that would be if there was an appeal, a successful appeal, and the banding was changed. If it was found by the assessor that there was an error in the valuation, they can change the banding at that point. And the other scenario is where, for example, somebody has carried out alterations to their property. The alterations and works were significant enough to push that dwelling into another band. The banding can't actually be changed until the house is subsequently sold. So on that basis, there may be new houses coming into the council tax list, valued exactly as they stand at that date. And sometimes what you find is people compare themselves to the one down the road that's probably about the same size, that's fully extended, but in a lower banding. And that is simply because of the legislation and the restriction on when bandings can change. Hopefully that's helped to answer your question. But if there's anything else, please ask.
Well, just a little bit more. Obviously, methods of construction and preferred building materials have changed a lot in a few decades. How does that impact that kind of disparity, especially when you might have older houses which are using materials that now would not be quite so acceptable?
It really depends on the market, in the sense that there are some houses that are older that, depending on where they are and how they're designed, might be actually more attractive to buyers than the modern equivalent. But I totally take your point. Sometimes there's things that come in that are in construction now that just didn't exist in 1991. So you are just trying to compare as best you can to, I suppose, like the modern equivalent, and take account of these extra things. It does make it challenging, there's no doubt, but these differences between the houses are always going to be there no matter when you revalue, and it's valuer's judgment that would be able to go in and look at, you know, well, this house has that's beneficial, it might cut down the running costs, etc. But it's all usually seen in the price that a house achieves on the open market.
So if there were a wholesale revaluation or reassessment of the whole system, what do you think has to be kept in mind to avoid these problems just being repeated?
What I would say is there are assumptions in council tax that assessors must stick to when valuing. These assumptions aren't always the case on an open market sale. So, for example, when we're valuing for council tax, we have to gather our base and we look at sales around the valuation date, so in this case still 1991, and we know exactly what that property looked like in 1991. The same would have to be done in another revaluation exercise. We need to know that that sale was an open market sale with a willing seller, because if you put all sales into the pot, you will be having maybe repossessions, sales between parties that maybe, for example, a divorce or if somebody dies. So these are not really open market sales. So we have to be clear that when we're establishing our basis, that is a clean basis, and we know the sales and we know exactly the property that it relates to on the ground. And that helps. I think the scenario you described, where there's maybe new construction methods coming on and new designs, there has been 32 years, so there will have been quite a bit of change. More frequent revaluations would pick up more changes in markets and in construction methods as well.
Thanks. And I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Emma's started to talk about the question that I was going to ask in relation to what a re-evaluation would look like. But if I could ask more about the specifics in terms of how long would it take? Do we have the right amount of assessors, for example, in order to undertake such a task? And what role could there be for computing and technological solutions such as statistical valuation methods? So I'm looking at things like Zoopla, online platforms of those equivalents. How would that work, and do we have the systems in place in order to carry out a full re-evaluation?
Okay, I'll start on this one. In terms of how long, at the moment, obviously the legislation as it stands, it's assessors' responsibility to compile and maintain a council tax valuation list. And for us, we would need to look at what else is going on. Just for the benefit of the committee, there has been major reform to the non-domestic rating system in recent years that resulted as a result of the Barclay review into non-domestic rating in 2017. So we now carry out non-domestic revaluations every 3 years. What would probably need to be considered is the timetable. If there were to be a council tax revaluation as well, clearly you don't want the two things happening at once. You would try and balance out the resource. So that would certainly be taken into account. We carry out our statutory duties at the moment. Obviously, in relation to the budgets we have, we do what we need to do. We don't do anything extra. So, for example, at the moment, the legislation states that a band can be changed, as I described earlier, if the house has alterations to it. We can't change the band until it's subsequently sold. So, as a matter of course, most assessors do not routinely go out and visit absolutely every alteration that's carried out. We only do it when we need to do it, which would be when there has been a subsequent sale, and that's when we focus on it. This then means that there are a lot of alterations that have taken place in the last 32 years that haven't been looked at, because at the moment there's absolutely no need for assessors to look at them. So we would need to carry out that exercise to bring the records that we have on every property up to date. So we have looked at that, and we have estimated it would need a 3-year lead-in time to be able to get all the survey work up to date and then to carry out the revaluation exercise. In terms of enough assessors, there are 14 assessors in Scotland, each of them having their own service and department. Obviously, this would be a new piece of work, an increased workload. So we would need to bring in more resource to be able to do that. We would also look at the technology side of things. In the last 32 years, I'm very pleased to say there has been a positive move in being able to use technology in a much bigger way than we did in 1993. So that's something we would certainly look at. What I would mention around, you touched on Zoopla and Rightmove, where you can go in and look at sales, etc. Valuation, it's not an exact science, but also I mentioned as well about putting sales into a pot. If you put all sales into a pot at 1991 and then all sales from, say, 2025 into the pot and look at the percentage change, it could either be throughout Scotland, but it would give more detail. Obviously, it could be in a council area, it could be in a street. But you're basically maybe just uplifting something that wasn't quite right in the first place. So I go back to the basis of the valuation, which is making sure that the actual physical details of the house is correct for the date of sale, and that the sale is an open market sale, willing buyer, willing seller, everything that surrounds the assumptions for council tax. obviously, as I said as well, around council tax, we're assuming something's in a reasonable state of repair. Some of the open market sales are reflective of the fact that a house is not in a very good state of repair. So actually putting that value on a house may not really, isn't giving it a council tax valuation. So there's all sorts of things that it may seem, yeah, you could just take that all 1991 values and uplift them to 2025. But when it then becomes the appeal process, you're having to defend these values. In 1993, we did look back and see what the appeal percentage was in 1993, and it was just under 5%, 4.88%. Of that, there was 3% of these actual appeals where the values then did change. So when you look at that in context, it's what was done was accurate and widely accepted at that time. And that was without the benefit of computers, but obviously the computers can help, and they can, provide that mathematical exercise very quickly and very easily. But these things then need checked against the background to make sure it's accurate, and it's really important to get that base correct in the first place to be able to then apply it to all other houses.
No, that's really helpful, and I feel as though I'm reliving the first house my husband and I bought, because we had all of these issues going through with the re-evaluation of it as well. Just referring back to last week's session, Professor Hill suggested that the cost of re-evaluation in Wales could be used as a starting point for the estimation of costs for here in Scotland. But given Scotland has, I think it's something along the lines of 1.8 times more households than there are currently in Wales, would a cost of £25 million be a fair estimate, or would it not be the case that you'd be able to share that with us just now?
What I would say we would be happy to do is take away, if we can be provided with a specification for a council tax exercise, whatever that may look like, we would be very happy to engage with other assessors and come back with a cost. I think it's so important to get the specification right so we can give you an accurate figure back. Otherwise, we could be looking and thinking about very different things, because there's obviously been various things discussed around reform as well. So it's important that whatever cost we give reflects what you're actually asking for. So, but happy to do that, happy to take that away if necessary.
Thank you. And just finally, Convener, if I may, just on the point of appeals with this work, there might be a likelihood of increased appeals coming through the system, and how, I'm talking hypothetically here of course, but how would that be managed in terms of more people appealing, and again, do we have the resources for that?
Well, we would need to bring in more resource for it, because if we were to assume a similar level of appeal to 1993, and obviously you can't deal with that sort of percentage overnight. So assuming 3 years, say, to deal with the level of proposals, and then it depends when the next revaluation was being thought about as well. So these are the types of things that would need to be considered in the mix of a revaluation, and then what happens thereafter. We would need to bring in more resource. We're not currently resourced to be able to deal with a revaluation for council tax and the subsequent proposals that would come and appeals that would come in on the back of it.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, I would actually totally agree with Heather around the resource. The resourcing is key for assessors to price give a realistic cost on how much a revaluation is going to take, and also how we deal with the aftermath. Say, for example, if there was a 5% appeal rate, then you're talking about, I don't know, 135,000 appeals across the country that would need to be dealt with over a decent period of time. And there's also the impact on the Scottish Courts Tribunal Service, the first tier tribunal local taxation chamber, if these end up going there as well. So a real, for us to really give you a clear indication, the specification needs to be fundamentally clear as to what you want, and that would help. That would probably give you a bit more clarity and assurance around how much it would cost for the assessors to deliver a revaluation.
Well, that's really helpful, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Megan. And we're now going to move to questions from Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. You already touched on some of the views, but it would be good to get a more indication about the limitations and the benefits of using a banding system as opposed to the flat percentage capital value that has been used in Northern Ireland. And it would be good to see what your views on that are when we're looking at banding in comparison to a percentage of the capital value. Maybe Heather first. Thank you, Heather.
I'm happy to take that one. In terms of the mass appraisal system, we have touched on that earlier. I think that would be, certainly computerisation would certainly help us this time, cut out a lot with the maths, etc. So absolutely, in that case, the percentage that has obviously been undertaken in Northern Ireland, assessors could certainly deliver on that as well, in terms of providing a discrete valuation as opposed to a banding. Previously, a long time ago, before poll tax came in, it was a rate system that was used on houses. And at that time, obviously, it was, whatever you paid, it was paid on your rateable value, which for each house was individual. So the non-domestic rates side, again, it's a discrete value, and paid on the basis of that discrete value. So it is absolutely achievable rather than a band. As I mentioned earlier, from an assessor's point of view, we are here really more, we implement, rather we can advise and say this would be the consequences of doing this and this would be the consequences of doing that. But in terms of the actual decisions around what will come in, that one for the policymakers.
So the benefits already are there from having computerisation that would maybe enhance that system and working in today's world in comparison to what it was in the past. And you don't foresee there being too many limitations that would incur with your own organisations and how things would be managed for your assessors and individuals within the process.
Well, we've certainly, assessors have discussed whether discrete versus bandings, etc., would be achievable. There has been no indication that a discrete valuation would not be able to be provided.
Okay, thank you. And Brian?
Yeah, I think the argument or the discussion around banding and discrete valuations is a good one. Northern Ireland, it seems to work in Northern Ireland. I think they have a cap on the maximum capital value, and I think I read last month, I think they're looking to do a revaluation in 2030 in Northern Ireland. I think my personal opinion around discrete valuations may be that the public could view this as a genuine shift away from council tax. The banding system does have winners or losers in it. Assessors do have problems trying to explain away if someone's either at the lower end of a band compared to another property. It's all around the comparative method of valuation, and if someone falls into the next banding and we can evidence it, then that's the problem around the edges. I think probably from a council side, they probably see banding as being a more stable level of collection for council tax, but that's out with my remit. But I'm sure Paul will come in on that.
And then Lisa, I think we'd love to hear the Welsh perspective as well.
Yes, I think that the council tax has got its many faults. It's been raised in various forums, but it has survived largely untouched for the last 31 years. 32 years now, and I think in that context, banding seems to be work for our customer base, and on that basis, I think having more bands to make it less regressive is entirely welcome, which is what Wales have done, and that's what's largely proposed. But I think to move away from banding probably makes it no longer council tax, and that's a political decision. So for me, while it's still council tax, banding is part of that sort of fundamentals of council tax, but that does not mean that council tax can't be replaced by another form of taxation based on discrete values.
Exactly. Lisa?
Yeah, thank you. The Welsh Government did commission research back from 2016 to 2021, looking at alternative methods. And one thing that they did look at was not only discrete values, but looking more on a land value tax basis. But the decision was made that, we remain with the system we've got. it might not be universally liked, but it's understood. It's property, it's visible. And with bans, there is kind of, you know, it's better to administer and better for the individual if you're looking at property values on a yearly or a constantly changing basis. I think, you know, it kind of works. And if, exactly as Paul just said, if you want to take it away too much to look at property values and elements of that, then we kind of end up going back to domestic rates to a degree, where we were up to 1990. I was 89 in Scotland, I know. But kind of, it might not be universally liked, but it does work, and property is visible. So you can actually see the asset and see what is there. But yes, there was research commissioned, and I know land value tax was definitely a preferred option for some other parties, but we are maintaining the council tax system here in Wales.
Yep. And following on from that, Lisa, you introduced a new band, a band I. In Scotland, we only have the A to H. And are there plans to introduce any further? And what was the benefit of introducing that band I?
When we introduced Band I, so as I mentioned, that was on the 2005 revaluation, so 2003 property values. So we added the band for properties 424,000 and up. In the last consultation that Welsh Government issued, the phase 2 for council tax, what would have been implemented this year but has now been slightly delayed, there was a proposal there to add 3 bands. There was a proposal to maintain the current 9 system. But also when you looked at how wide property prices now ranged, it seemed much more fair to the customer to actually make the bands reflect current values. So they proposed adding a band at the bottom and a further 2 bands at the top. Even looking at Band I, properties 424,000 and above, they're now looking at bands up to 1 million and 1.5 million above. And I'm sure you've got properties of exactly that same nature and higher in Scotland. So the last proposal was, which did seem to be the most reflective of the property market, and perhaps to the council taxpayer, who's probably the most important person in this, they can visibly see how their property band, how they sit in relation to, well, actually, yes, I'm, someone who's in Band I at 400,000. Well, somebody who's in Band I at 1.something million should be paying considerably more. So I think when the proposal for the 12 bands was announced, with looking at the property values within that, it made it quite transparent to the council taxpayer. Whether they all appreciate, whether it's fair or not, but at least you can actually see, and you can see the movement. So you may be moving up a band or down a band in a revaluation, but you can see where you are in relation to other properties. And I think from a public understanding and perception, that's incredibly beneficial. But yes, that is the latest discussion is, we need additional bands. You can't look at such a wide range of property prices and condense them into 9 bands. That would not add any fairness to the system at all.
And as far as Scotland's concerned, we have the 8 bands at the moment. Would you be willing, or do you think there's the potential for developing the bands within Scotland in exactly what Lisa said, for properties that are at the top end and also for ones at the bottom end? There may be disparity between the 2 ends of the system, in the majority being in the middle band range. But do you think Scotland could cope with that, or would that be something that you think is potentially manageable? Paul?
So the ideal position was in our submission is that we would propose 1 more band at the bottom and 2 more bands at the top as a starter for 10. I think that whole regressiveness nature and making sure that people can see that transparently. I think Lisa's right. A property that's worth 10 times another property can't be in the same band as that property. That's the issue we have at present. But I think that for us, is that 1 extra band at the bottom and 2 at the top is a minimum, and that's what's in our submission. I think from an assessment point of view, they can answer whether that's feasible. But I think it's down to the government to politicians to say what those bandings look like, and I think that certainly I go back to that point. Although Wales currently have a higher band than us in that Band I, they don't have a higher ratio. So a Scottish Band H pays more compared to Band E than a Welsh Band I. I think that's quite important to note that.
Yeah, thank you. Any other views, Heather?
Just to suggest, from an assessor's point of view, for us, we would just slot the valuation into where the bands were. And I completely agree with Lisa's point around the transparency. Yeah. We obviously have a Scottish assessor's website where you can look at council tax band for any property in Scotland, and that enables a taxpayer to compare them sells to other houses in the street or the area or any other town.
Thank you. Thank you, Kinnear.
Thanks very much. We're now going to move on to a new area around collaboration, consultation and communication. And for that, I'm going to bring in Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to all the panel, including those online. As the Convener says, I'm going to ask a few questions on collaboration, consultation and communication, but I do appreciate that some of that's already been built into the answers you've already given, so I do apologise for that. Probably turning to those online first, a majority of respondents to the Welsh Government's 2022 consultation said that they did not want to see a re-evaluation in 2025, but the Welsh Government is progressing with this anyway for 2028. So I'm just wondering how the Welsh Government built consensus, political consensus, in the face of these concerns, and is it or was it a case that political consensus is more important than what the public think in this instance? Happy with Lisa here, thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, you are right. I mean, the question that the Welsh Government put in for council tax, you know, do you agree there should be a revaluation? Higher percentage said no, then actually agreed with it. But because it was a commitment to look at the whole range of council tax and make it fairer, then they carried on and proceeded to a further consultation. There were different responses and kind of a much more varied response to consultation 2, which gave more details because that actually broke information down. The first question was, do you agree there should be, you know, a revaluation in 2025 was quite vague, without all the information about how the property bands would change, looking at up-to-date property values. So when there was the second consultation in 2023, there were 3 approaches to designing a better system. So it was maintaining the current system, with revalued properties, updating the bands, changing the tax rates across the bands, and then completely changing from 9 to 12 bands. So I think what the Welsh Government, and you know, they could answer this a lot more clearly than we can. They did focus groups. They had they engaged with an external company to actually do public engagement sessions and actually try to pull out the knowledge and the understanding around council tax. And I think that's something that we can't underestimate in this. There are people, and I mentioned, you know, and Heather mentioned earlier, and it did make me smile when I read in earlier, people paying council tax based on property value before they were even born, which you think, yeah, actually, because it's there and it's long-standing, maybe we're all guilty of not reaffirming the message of what it is, what council tax does and pays for, and kind of how important it is as that contribution to society. And I think that's something that the Welsh Government then did take on board by having wider engagement sessions, public engagement sessions, an absolute raft of different work groups, specific work groups, academic input. I think from the Welsh Local Government Association's perspective, we played kind of a key role in that, bridging that political and people side of it. So what was a Welsh Government intention against what is kind of perhaps a local authority understanding or operation of council tax, and drawing everything together. But when you mentioned about collaboration and communication, absolutely, it's got to be, you know, such a key consideration, having all parties on board as soon as possible, establishing where your key issues are going to be, public understanding, looking at other areas around the whole system, looking at discounts, etc., having key forum of strategic people on board. I think the whole collaboration and communication, which we're still learning from it, we can still improve. But information out there in the public domain, public engagement sessions, really actually emphasising what we're trying to do to make it fairer. Because as soon as you mention revaluing council tax, you can say revenue neutral. What does that really mean? People look at their council tax bills that go up annually and go, well, how is that going to be? What does revenue neutral mean to me as a council taxpayer? My property has increased. Of course, my bill's going to go up. So it's got to be that real good public communication to try and emphasise we're bringing it up to date. We're bringing it all on a new level playing field, and then we will be doing that regularly moving forward. So everybody stays in that position. You don't have the lag. I'm mentioning about when properties get significantly expanded. doubling the size and perhaps in some cases more than doubling the value, but nothing changes to the tax payable. So it's that whole communication. It is absolutely key on that one. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And just turning to Scottish colleagues, do you think there's anything, based on what Lisa said there, that the Scottish or a future Scottish Government could learn in terms of any consultation on council tax, given that the results that the consultation in Wales did get, but given the strength of political opinion, which I think is shared round this table and round this Parliament as well, to reform the council tax current situation? Is there anything you think we could learn from that?
I mean, certainly, in my own view, if you are going to be trying to bring in something new, the clearer it is for people, the more chance you've got of acceptance. And especially if, say, for example, assessors start going out to survey properties, immediately people will be wondering, well, why are you here for this? So the more messaging that goes out in advance and a greater understanding of what's coming would, and allowing opportunity as well to ask questions, would all appear to be a good thing.
Okay, thanks for that.
Before you move on, Matthew wanted to come in on the previous question.
Oh, sorry, Matthew.
Matthew.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Just to build on what Lisa has said, I think generally the public have an incredibly negative perception around council tax. Everybody automatically assumes council tax significantly increases each year. Certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, probably across the country, council tax has increased probably a lot more than it has in previous years. Ironically, I was looking back several years and our council tax for the precept for Wrexham was about £1,000. It's now £1,600 over a period of years. So that builds a significant increase. I think there was a lot of work, as Lisa said, undertaken around focus groups just to help build opinion. But I think there's a much larger piece of work needed by Welsh Government to actually outline the fact that any proposed changes would be revenue neutral. Regardless of what scheme may come in 2028, ideally it would increase the number of bands to make it actually reduce some of the issues around regressivity of council tax, but there needs to be a much clearer explanation made around the fact that this is what it will actually mean, and in some cases actually explain when people are paying less and make that clearer for some people, because I think that was lost on many people.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Matthew. I was actually going to come back to you and ask a wee bit about the collaboration with local government, because I know that the Welsh Local Government Association submission described the changes leading up to 2005 as intense. So thanks very much for both yourself and your colleagues' views and expanding on that. I'm just wondering, though, if Scottish colleagues, how they would describe the joint working group in Scotland. Do you believe that that's similar to some of the collaborative work that's went on in Wales, or is there more to be learned from that? Paul, yeah.
Yeah, obviously the IWB Scotland is represented on the group through Les Robertson, who's the chair of the Revenues Forum for our body. I think man, certainly we're learning from what's happened in Wales, and that's certainly a topic for discussion, and obviously we can improve on what we've done in the past. I think that where there's that message about actually what are we doing, what's the impact going to be, is really important in this message. But I think there's a real concern that this could be ambushed by those who know they're going to be disadvantaged. So Heather spoke about those who've had an improvement to their property not been sold. They're likely to know that they're going to lose out of this change. And by the same token, there's people who know that their property value when they bought it was significantly above the national average. They're going to see that as well. So I think it's really important actually why we're doing this. We're doing this to protect those probably largely in that 20 to 40% of the lower income thresholds, to make sure that they're not paying too high a charge. And to enable us to do that, we need to actually pay a little bit more for those who are above that threshold. So I think that it's controlling that narrative. But I think that in Falkirk we've done a lot of sessions with our public. Budget sessions, council tax is not well understood at all just now, so we are starting from a very low base. So when we go out to do these, that information needs to be out in different forums and different avenues to make sure that before people ask a question, to understand what that question really means, because at present I would say in Scotland that's not the case.
Okay, you've actually sort of went on to what I was going to go on and ask, and you know, if we heard last week that there was some concerns raised by the witnesses about misunderstandings around a likely re-evaluation. We've heard from Welsh colleagues as well today that perhaps that can lead to the negativity in consultations and stuff like that, because people automatically think a re-evaluation means their council tax has gone up, so better just to leave it as it is. But what role do you think then the Scottish Government and councils should have in ensuring that the public are properly informed about possible changes? Is there any practical examples you can think of what government and councils can do to try and engage people and say, you know, this is what we're trying to do? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, assessors went on the joint working group, so it's maybe something the joint working group can add more on. But what I would say is there are two aspects to council tax, and I think that can sometimes be, you know, often people just think of the bill because that's what they relate to when it comes through the door. But the valuation, the council tax banding, forms the basis for the charging. And so it'd be useful, I think, to get information out on two counts, because then obviously the clearer things are, there's the appeal process as well, etc. So, you know, there are the two slants to this, and it's important that both are communicated, I would say.
Right.
Yeah, I would echo that, but I think public engagement and awareness needs to be on the ground. I can recall being at an event where Northern Ireland made a presentation around the 2005 revaluation, and they were at the point where they were putting signs on bus stops and on buses, and that effectively reduced the number of appeals they got. The communication needs to be clear, concise, and you need to bring the public along. That's both nationally and locally, and commit and not let things drag on, as we've seen delays in Wales around the revaluation. There needs to be a real commitment, so there's clarity for the taxpayers going forward.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks very much. Just one final question, convener, if that's all right. It's probably for yourself, Paul. Last week we heard the re-evaluation would be a vital first step before any further reforms, and I'm just wondering what other reforms the IRRV would like to see in Scotland, if you've got any thoughts on that.
We've got quite a few thoughts, and I think they all follow on from the revaluation and the bandings we set. But I think there's one thing in Scotland is different from Wales and England, which is the water charge. And I think that was raised last week as well. That obviously, we charge water along with council tax. We currently charge at a different ratio to the bands for bands ETH, so it's not consistent in terms of that calculation either. And the other thing is that we only protect those in the lowest income from 35% of that water charge. So I suppose the Scottish IRV's position is that we would like to see probably the discount of water charges to be removed to enable that full protection of those in full council tax reduction to be applied. So i.e. somebody who pays no council tax, we believe should also pay no water charge, because just now there's a slightly confusing picture there. So that's one part, dealing with the water charge. The other part we talk about is actually whether or not the single person discount at its current rate is still appropriate. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is, do we want to obviously incentivise under-occupational properties? We then have also the issue that people in higher bands, in a band H, receive almost 4 times as much financial support as somebody in a band A getting that discount. So fundamentally, is that right? Is that what we want to do? And then if we did remove that or reduce that, we could probably give more means-tested support through the council tax reduction scheme to actually target those who we know have a low income and give them more support. So I think that obviously all discounts, all exemptions, all ratios need to be considered as part of this wider review, but I suppose fundamentally the big tickets are the water charges and the single person discount. They need to be front and centre of that discussion.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And yes, you covered the question on water charge, which we had there very specifically, but clearly that is an issue. And that was interesting to hear about the fact that people who are not paying council tax still have to pay water charges. And that seems to be a bit of a discrepancy there. That concludes our questions. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I think that's been very helpful, both to hear from the Scottish perspective, but also thank you to our Welsh colleagues for joining us. Certainly you're ahead of the curve, and hopefully we can learn from what you've been doing and see some changes coming to Scotland at some point soon. I'm now going to briefly suspend business to allow for our witnesses to leave the table. The next item on our agenda today is to consider two negative instruments. The first is Non-Domestic Rates Valuation of Utilities Scotland Amendment Order 2025. Do members have any comments on this instrument? No one has any comments. Does the committee agree that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? We're agreed. Thank you. And the second negative instrument is the Local Governance Scotland Act 2004 Remuneration Amendment Regulations 2025. Do any members have any comments on this instrument? No one has any comments. Does the committee agree that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? We're agreed. Thank you. And we previously agreed to take the next items in private. So as that was the last public item on our agenda for today, I now close the public part of the meeting.